Hello, and welcome to the Building Bridges Initiative webinar entitled Residential and Child Welfare Partnerships Towards Ensuring Permanent Connections. My name is Sherry Hammock, and I'm the National Coordinator for Building Bridges Initiative that we commonly refer to as BBI. And so we're glad that you've joined us today to hear about information and strategies that you may use to ensure permanent connections and relationships. So we are going to hear from Plummer Youth Promise and a child welfare leader from Massachusetts area where Plummer is in just a few moments, and so we're looking forward to sharing that with you. But I wanted to do a couple of housekeeping tips and give you a little bit about BBI overview ahead of that. So for everyone on the phone lines, your line is muted, so you won't be able to ask questions or make comments until the very end, where there will be a designated question and answer time. You can, however, if you're on the computer, write in a comment or chat and a question, and we'll try to include those, especially clarifying questions, along the way. Secondly, the slides to the presentation are available at the bottom left-hand side under File Share. And so you are able to access those in a PDF format, and you can print those out and be able to follow along or have them as a handout for later. So again, welcome everyone, and I wanted to give you a little bit of background about BBI, the Building Bridges Initiative. And here is the mission statement for BBI that you can read, but I want to emphasize that BBI proposes a framework from which residential programs can implement best practices. And we do that through partnerships and collaborations with multiple folks, including state leadership and families and young people. And we do this under the guise of values of family-driven, youth-guided, culturally and linguistically competent, and being sensitive to that. But one of the things I wanted to point to was that the practices and the strategies that we hold up and bring to people whenever we're providing technical assistance around the country is that we bring those strategies that are consistent with the research that backs up long-term, sustained, positive outcomes post-discharge. So I think a lot of times when we were talking about serving young people in residentially based programs is that we look at outcomes, oh, they're doing well while they're in the program, but what we're really shooting for is ensuring that upon discharge, even as far as 1 year to 3 years out, that they're successful and they're doing well in the community, within a safe and nurturing family, and within a community-based setting. That is the goal, and those are the caveats that our framework provides. So with that, we really sometimes, I feel like, get into a divide of us and them between residential intervention and community-based intervention. And there was some work that was done some time back, and that was created through a summit with community-based providers and residentially based providers, and they came up with a BBI joint resolution. And that has really been some foundational work that's kicked off the work that we do. And so on this slide, you can see that on the website, the BBI website, that you can find the joint resolution. And Dr. Gary Blau, who is the Chief Director of the Child and Family Services in the Mental Health Division at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration at the federal level, is a contact for the joint resolution, as well as the Director of BBI, Beth Caldwell. So if you read through that joint resolution and find, well, this is something that my organization can strive to do. These are the principles and values, not that you've necessarily achieved all that, but you can commit to striving toward those those tenets and that activity that's listed in the joint resolution, and you'd like to endorse the resolution, you can contact Gary, Beth, or myself and say that you want to be listed as a partner to BBI. And what that will do will put you on a listserv to receive documents that come out of the newest research, and to be the first to be invited to BBI events, that we can keep folks informed about those that are coming out. So I just encourage you to look at that, because I think that document is a good document that provides the overall framework and the goals and guiding principles for best practices in residential interventions. So if you go to the BBI website, again on this slide at the top, you'll see some of those guidance documents or tip sheets, or just general guidance. The last one that we've put out recently is implementing effective short-term residential interventions. And so if you go on the website, you can click on that and read some of those guidance or articles that support some of the research that can guide us on residential best practices. And then you can see some of the other documents there listed below that. Some folks are interested in obtaining continuing education units when they're reviewing best practices, and so we also wanted to offer this website at the Institute at Maryland, and these are in relationship to the Building Bridges initiative as well. And so you can log in there. I believe you have to get an account, but it doesn't cost anything. You can get an account and listen to those particular webinars and receive CEUs for them. So just wanted to invite you to do that if you needed to get that for your certifications. So the core principles of BBI are very much in line with some of the SAMHSA-supported system of care framework principles as well. And so that would be that in all the strategies that we're looking at, that we're looking for a strong component of being family-driven and youth-guided, and authentically so. I think sometimes we use those words, but really looking at, well, what does that mean, and how do we do that? And this is some of the things that we're going to learn from Plummer today. And then really, truly looking at how are we being culturally and linguistically sensitive in the way that we deliver services and the way that we operate our businesses, too. We also look for clinical excellence and quality standards, and that speaks to that research-based, evidence-informed practice, and accessibility and community involvement, that residential intervention is part of the continuum of care with community-based involvement. And the other core principle is looking at transition planning and services, whether that's transition between settings or transition from youth to adulthood. So again, I could speak to all of those principles for an extensive amount of time, but I wanted to point to those and let you know that a lot of the strategies, or many of the strategies that we train to and support and put out publications around, these are the cornerstone principles that are provided in the work that we're doing. So with that, I wanted to offer the contact information here if you want to contact any of us at BBI or with Dr. Blau at the SAMHSA at the federal level and inquire more about BBI, that you are welcome to do that. We'll offer this slide at the end of the webinar as well, so you can have that information. But I appreciate your participation in being here today and listening to the webinar so that you can implement best practices. And so with that, I am going to turn the webinar over to Plummer Youth Promise for their presentation.
Thank you, Sherry. I hope everybody can hear me well. My name is James Lister, and I'm the Executive Director of Plummer Youth Promise. We are a nonprofit, primarily child welfare provider in Massachusetts, and we provide a range of services to youth in residential care, foster care, a variety of community-based services, independent living services, and recently started providing some training and technical assistance to other providers in child welfare jurisdictions. So that's kind of an overview of us as an organization. Just a little bit of business context. We're a $4 million organization with 50 staff, and we serve around 225 kids over the course of a year across the programs I just described. So I'm going to start by talking about the definition of permanency, and I find it easiest sometimes to describe when kids don't have permanency, and I think this was part of my early learning. And for those of us that work in residential programs, the slide you're looking at and what I'm about to talk about is probably something you've seen as well, but it is very common for kids to come to us who've been growing up in the child welfare system that don't get birthday cards or phone calls on their birthday and have nowhere to go on the holidays, have little or no pictures of their childhood and family. They travel in trash bags in terms of all of their belongings. And when you ask them about emergency contacts, they often list staff and social workers. And another thing that's really powerful to me is whenever we ask, where are you from, they talk about their last program, and not about their family, their community, their history. They say, I came from program X. So I think this really puts into kind of context and hopefully tees up a sense of urgency around how lonely the kids that we often can work with in child welfare. Again, to reiterate, my perspective is primarily child welfare, older youth that have been in care for a long period of time. So the different populations you might work with might be a little bit different, but this presentation is largely around older kids in foster care that are in placement. In terms of a formal definition, this is what we use here to train our staff. I'm sorry, hold on, a different slide. So here I'm going to talk about, again, from my perspective here, in my own experience in Massachusetts, the traditional child welfare approach for older youth in residential. And I look back to my time as a practicing social worker and a staff member at residential programs and think about how many youth I would work with that were 15, 16, 17 years old, and we would have quarterly treatment plan meetings. And if Johnny, for example, was going to school, staying out of trouble, doing well academically, had a job, was on an independent living track, we'd have a very brief meeting and all assume that things were going really, really well. All the meanwhile, Johnny had no family and no safety net. And so that was the way we practiced here at Plummer for a long period of time, and how I practiced as a state social worker and caseworker at a private provider. And remember countless conversations saying to kids, look, you've had an unfortunate life and it's really bad, and I'm here to do everything I can to help prepare you for adulthood and teach and have you get the skills you need, the education you need to be successful. But at the end of the day, I was really teaching kids to live without family, not with family. So some classic bullets here that the idea that youth are given a choice to be parented or not. You know, I remember having conversations with lots of kids when they turn 16 and their goal can change to APLA here in Massachusetts, and we start to have a dialogue about whether they want to go down an independent living track or try to get back to family if they even have one. And as I look back at that, the notion that we're just really giving a 16-year-old child an option whether they want to be parented or not, or have a family or not, just really didn't make any sense. So I'm going to move on from this slide, but basically we practiced in a way that when kids didn't have any resources when they came to us, their parental rights have been terminated, they said they didn't want to be adopted, we believed that there weren't any family resources out there for teens, we were very much committed to preparing kids to live successfully on their own to the extent that that's even reasonable. when we train our staff here at Plummer, we talk about the primary purpose of child welfare. And when a child or youth is involved with child welfare, we should be laser focused on one of three things. And that's, when possible, to keep kids home or have kids stay home and make sure that's done in a way that's safe. And if that's not possible and kids need to be removed from their families, then we have a responsibility to be really focused on either having them go back home when that's safe and appropriate, and if that's not safe and appropriate, finding them a new home. And if you think back to the previous slide, working with those 14, 15, 16-year-olds that are on independent living tracks, we're not focused on them either going home or finding home. We're focused on them learning how to live on their own. So this slide is from the Developing Child Study at Harvard, and I like this quote. It says, "The single most common factor for children who end up doing well is having the support of at least one stable and committed relationship with a parent, caregiver, or other adult." And what I want to highlight in this slide is that it's not simply about a stable relationship over time. It's a stable relationship that's with a parent, caregiver, or adult. And when we first started scratching at this permanency work at Plummer, we started with the idea that everybody should have a lifelong connection. And we didn't even say family. We just thought if they could have that continuity and stability or a network of adults that were available, that that would be successful. And that, in many cases, is still considered a success, but we are very much focused on kids having a legal family through adoption, reunification, or guardianship as our goal for all the kids we work with, regardless of their age or state DCF goal. I'm going to talk a little bit about our transformation to becoming an organization focused on permanency. And I want to go back to 2005, and that's when I was first hired here at Plummer. And at the time, we were just a single service group home with a capacity of 10 that served approximately 24 kids over the course of a year. And our service quality was very mediocre, and our infrastructure was very poor from kind of a management standpoint. And so we spent the first couple of years, at least of my time here, improving some basic infrastructure stuff on the kind of financial and back end, but then creating improvements to the milieu. And so prior to coming to Plummer, I was a state social worker. I worked primarily with older youth that were in placement. And so I had a lot of experience of seeing things that I thought were great and worked at other programs. So we made some significant changes with the support of our board, and we staffed better than our state contract required. When our kids needed additional tutoring or educational support, we raised money against that, made that a priority. We improved the facility. We funded mentors. We purchased family vehicles so our kids didn't have the stigma of a giant van that said Plummer on the side. We created a work program so our kids could earn money here on campus. A music program for those that wanted to participate in it. Red Sox games, yoga, chores and allowance, healthy cooking, improved training and support to our staff. A significant number of improvements. And I can say in full confidence that we certainly improved the experience of care while the youth and young people were with us, but we were still seeing them leave to poor outcomes, not truly being ready for adulthood or family or even having family. So despite all these improvements, which I think were necessary and I still think are necessary in a residential program, the idea that you're improving your physical facility and milieu in the absence of trying to find a family for the kids that we work with just didn't really seem to make sense for us. So we decided to begin on a transformation of changing our, what we were essentially a generic group home to one that was really focused. And that was sparked a lot by staff frustration. I mentioned earlier all the improvements that we did, and I still remember staff meetings where we're dropping 18-year-old kids off at a homeless shelter. Despite the improved milieu and the additional educational support they had and the Red Sox games they went to and the camping trips and the better staff training, we weren't preparing them for long-term success with a family. So that led to our strategic plan, and that was a long process, but the 5 core components that came out of our strategic plan were permanency, preparedness, community. Those are kind of the 3 clinical and program elements of the strategic plan. And then the idea that we wanted to commit to philanthropy to support some of the things that weren't funded by the state, and the idea that we wanted to build an outcome system to ensure that the work we're doing is effective across all the services that we provided. So that's when we started to get focused. This strategic planning process started in 2005, but it actually began to be implemented around closer to 2009. And even in 2009, when we first had that strategic plan, we've since gone through another reiteration of it. Our vision was, and keep in mind, the vision statement is your pie-in-the-sky dream for your organization. So they are statements like clean water for everyone, end world hunger, no child hungry. And so our vision back in 2009 was a community committed to providing all children the support necessary to successfully navigate into adulthood. So keep in mind that our vision back then was really preparing kids to live on their own. And that was the best thing we could essentially hope for if you talk about the true definition of a vision. And we just redid this vision over last year, or 2 years now, and now our vision is that every young person has a family unconditionally committed to nurture, protect, and guide them to successful adulthood. So I think that these 2 vision statements really tell the story quite well. I'm going to talk about some core components around our transformation, and they're really into these bullets: leadership, funding, partnerships, practice, staff development, and data and outcomes. Our transformation started with leadership, and certainly needed to start to leadership. Our leadership team was very much committed to this idea, and was very much part of a strategic plan that ultimately led us to permanency, preparedness, and community. We established initially an advisory committee, and so I was very much committed to the notion and the idea that permanency was critical in child welfare, and more particularly in the program in which I managed, but I was not quite an expert on it, or not even close. So I established an advisory committee that met once a month to kind of just start to talk about tools, techniques, practice models, so on and so forth. We engaged our board early on with intensive training around permanency and the importance of it, and they jumped on board, no pun intended, right away. And we created, this is recently a permanency practice leadership division, so we can help and support other providers in child welfare jurisdictions. So in terms of the transformation and funding, residential providers most have some flexibility in their how they use the money they raise privately. We see this very often in capital improvements, vocational programs, all sorts of great, neat add-ons to residential programs. But we made permanency our funding priority. And so very much we said, let's really swing for the fences on kind of creating a permanency-driven organization. We launched a capital campaign against that. And you could certainly have made the case back then that we should have raised the capital campaign against the building, the residential programs, but we made this our priority. And the premise behind that being that if we can successfully get our kids out of the system to safe family and demonstrate that that works over time, that will ultimately drive the success of this organization. We'll be able to get to things like the building down the road. In addition to making it a financial priority from a private money standpoint, we were fortunate enough to develop a pilot program with our state partner. Here in Massachusetts, the child welfare organization is called DCF, Department of Children and Families. So we partnered with a DCF to pilot some work where we hired permanency coaches on a couple of specific cases. So in terms of transformation, partnerships was key here. Like I said earlier, we developed a pilot project in partnership with DCF. And at the time, I remember specifically sitting down with our clinical staff and looking at the 10 kids in our group home and saying, all right, we got to pick 2 to pilot this permanency work. It was one of the most difficult professional decisions I remember making, because I was saying, how are we going to pick, which 2 are we going to pick to give a shot at family, and which 8 are we going to keep on this independent living track? But we had to start somewhere, and we did, and we hired a permanency coach to do that. We communicated shared responsibility for child welfare mandates of safety, permanency, and well-being, and reiterated our relationship with the state and an extension of the state really being responsible to a federal mandate around safety, permanency, and well-being. And then we strengthened our relationships with state partners and used collaboration to resolve barriers. And this was really critical and an important part of the work that we did, was to build strong relationships with our local offices, with the staff that we work with day in, day out, their supervisors, their managers, so on and so forth. So I have here with me today Derek Estella, who is a supervisor at one of the local offices, and we work very closely with that DCF office. And he oversees 100 cases, or whatever the number is of cases in his unit. And prior to being a supervisor, Derek oversaw all the quality to residential, all the referrals, quality assurance, so on and so forth, to residential programs. So he's going to talk a little bit about the partnership with DCF, but I'm going to start simply by asking Derek if you can talk about this partner relationship from your perspective.
Thanks, James. As he alluded to, I've had a couple of different roles within the Child Protective Agency here in Massachusetts. I'm sure when we get to the question and answer portion of this, some of that will probably come out. But with regard to partnering, partnering with Plummer here locally really was just a natural fit. Their organization in particular really has a strong presence in our community. By that I mean they're not simply just known to the families or the youth they support or our agency. They actually have gained the faith of a lot of our community partners, other providers, other state agencies, and certainly the juvenile justice branch that exists here locally. From our perspective, it's not typical that providers initiate an interest in this type of practice. So certainly, with our experience with Plummer, specific to the size of their organization, the number of youth that they provide placement to, it was really an interesting prospect. Oftentimes we operate on this, we need a youth to go into substitute care, we have a referral, we send it off, we kind of wait to hear back on whether there's room, whether a youth is appropriate or not, but ultimately we don't really hear from our placement providers how they're creating some shifts in their work that actually would serve to keep youth out of care or strengthen family situations. So I think on a leadership level, it was certainly an intriguing idea. And anytime you mix kind of what type of treatment or work might work well for youth or families, along with how we best use our resources, people start listening. I think the interesting thing about that, with regard to not many providers kind of initiating that kind of contact with DCF, is I think oftentimes that placement providers get stuck in the same position as some of their state agencies. I know that's probably difficult to hear because we're oftentimes on opposite ends, but this idea of trying to string together short-term progress for youth or families, whatever the time frame might be, but just in short-term segments, and then only looking at the bigger picture until it's too late, where we have a youth lingering in care for an extended period of time. These seem to be consistent things, and all of the time that I've engaged with providers or engaged with folks within my own agency, it seems to be a pretty consistent theme. I think when we break that down and we start to look at that closely, the number one thing that providers have always reported back is you stop engaging in placement or treatment when they lose hope. And that hope is really closely related to their sense of permanency. I think the same could be said from families or whoever the identified key folks are for those youth in care. I think child welfare agencies struggle to deliver that permanency in a lot of different ways, but one in particular, when youth are not presenting in such a way that they're showing progress in substitute care. So we have kind of that dynamic right there. We have youth not progressing because they don't have a sense of permanence, and agencies not able to help, state agencies not able to help youth and providers because the youth are not showing as they're progressing. So there's a shared interest, a lot stronger than folks might initially accept. I think also many times providers feel that they're at the mercy of their state partners. The strongest example I can just say is, oftentimes youth might go into a particular placement with a certain set of goals or understanding about what's to be achieved, and before long, the goals seem to morph into the expectations or the plans that the state agency might have instead of the provider. So it gets lost in that sense. The benefits of really doing this kind of work are so substantial. It's difficult for state agencies, in particular child protection agencies, because sometimes so much of the work that they're required to do, because of their other state mandates or depending on how strong their vision for protection is, really gets in the way of some of that day-to-day work. I know there's a way to accomplish both, but sometimes in the day-to-day work, it seems to contrast child protection work with permanency. One of the biggest challenge that we typically find that exists when we're talking about partnering with an agency, in particular Plummer here, on a project like this, is really a struggle over decision making or focus, or folks kind of entering into a potential power struggle. The interesting part is that the work itself usually resolves that. It's not necessarily some sort of large situation where things really need to be worked out or clarified. The beauty of the permanency work is that the impact is so significant and so beneficial that the work itself really kind of resolves any of those dilemmas that might come up with regard to who holds what role in the partnership and what voice is becoming more prevalent.
Great. Thanks, Derek. I also want to shift the conversation a little bit too. So we initially started and continue to do permanency work with youth that have been referred to our residential programs. Now we're spreading it across all of our programs, and it started to kind of gain some momentum, and our early outcomes are definitely positive around our ability to connect kids to family who otherwise would not have family. And that's allowed us to have conversations with the state on how we can help the state achieve better permanency outcomes with more youth. And I'm going to ask Derek to talk a little bit about a pilot program that we started where we can leverage our partnership with the state and our expertise around improving outcomes for youth far beyond those that are simply in our residential programs.
As I indicated before, the partnership with Plummer seemed like a pretty natural fit given their role in our community. But they were also really in a really good position approaching our agency, given kind of their historic focus on community and creating a family-type environment at Plummer. I've joked with some of my staff that for a long time, Plummer has presented itself as one of the most community-based providers that we engage with. And that seems like a pretty simple, straightforward statement, but ultimately it means that in the work that they've done, even prior to this real philosophical shift, they really focused on and emphasized a sense of permanency or connectedness for youth, and sought to create a family-type environment here, whether it's with the inclusion of youth's families or without, simply by creating it. They were acknowledging the importance of it. So I think when they approached our agency, our local leaders were really positioned to hear that. After meeting with our regional office to talk about how to deliver permanency services, they agreed on a pilot project that we refer to as IPS, Intensive Permanency Services, where our regional office, right up onto our central office, agreed for a way to unbundle some of their services. Typically, they had been seen primarily as a congregate care provider, and this really enabled them to become more of a supportive service provider. We met at the local level with our leadership team and with Plummer to brainstorm. We agreed on 5 cases originally, five cases involving 5 youth or family situations of a varying involvement, but ultimately the primary basis for them was youth lingering in care unnecessarily, or youth heading towards their early 20s with no real permanent plan in place or permanent family support. As part of this brainstorming, in addition to identifying 5 youth or families, we sought out to identify certain workers or supervisors within the office. We sought to find workers and supervisors that we thought could both champion the pilot project, but also those who were maybe in more leadership roles but would be challenged by the pilot. We sought the benefit in looking at both of those populations. When we established this, we really were able to let Plummer loose. I don't know that there were any real specific understanding of what we were going to see. They were able to interview workers. They mined our records. They developed a plan of engagement for clients, and people identified as being part of a youth family constellation. This work also led to Plummer identifying new stakeholders in youth lives that were previously unknown. It's been truly successful in re-engaging families that have otherwise been closed off to working with DCF, considering their historical experience with the agency. We've been carefully tracking outcomes, but we've also been open to how we're interpreting success or progress. I think we sometimes get caught up in how do we measure that or how do we don't. We obviously have a small sample size, and as James outlined in the slides before, the permanency goals are a little bit looser than identified some of your other treatment goals, which are far more specific. I can talk about a number of different examples. One that pops up most readily is a young adult male who's diagnosed with mental health issues, who's been in substitute care for over 10 years at this point, who's completely disconnected from his family. And this came to be because ultimately his mother was seen as the point of engagement for the entire family. And after allowing Plummer to become involved and engage with this young man and his extended family, he's established an entire network of family supports, including an estranged sister who is now communicating with them on a weekly basis. We have another almost 18-year-old young woman who has been in multiple foster homes. The token disrupted from multiple foster homes, who is now able to reside in the home of a great aunt, actually in her community, simply because she is able to have unrestricted access to her mother in that community, who she's been out of her care and custody for many, many years. So, again, we have limited time, but the examples are they're really pretty amazing. And some of them look like some of our traditional kind of success stories, but the beauty of this project has really allowed us to evaluate how we're looking at success and what that means.
Thanks, Derek. Appreciate that feedback or input. And I can again reiterate, as you consider kind of transformation, how critical it is to engage your state partners early on one level, but then it's an ongoing partnership and relationship over time, because for us anyways, it's been a different approach to doing the work. and if we're all focused ahead of time going into it, the outcomes tend to be a lot better, and we have a great team pursuing it. And the last element, I'll be brief here, around transformation is practice, because I'm going to ask Lauren to talk in more detail about it. But one bullet I wanted to highlight here, I talked to you earlier about permanency, preparedness, and community driving our treatment. We originally called that a model of care. And after carefully thinking through that, we wanted to move away from the term care and its link or implication of long-term care, raising children, treating children. Not to say that we certainly don't care deeply about the kids that we serve, but we wanted to move away from that, and we refer to our treatment as an intervention model, and the idea being that a residential stay is supposed to be an intervention and not this kind of long-term care approach. So I think that speaks to our commitment to the practice being an intervention. And we built really, very much, we signed on to the BBI principles before we really engaged the permanency work, but certainly the core principles of BBI have been driving the practice that we do here. And so I'm going to introduce Lauren Fry. She is our Director of Permanency Practice Leadership. And she oversees all of our kind of training and technical assistance, but also oversees all the training and ongoing consultation and implementation of the permanency work across all of our programs. So, Lauren, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, James and Derek. So I'm going to talk really briefly about our intervention and outcome model here. James mentioned that previously as a key point of transformation. So in terms of what we're doing on the ground together with youth and families, unless we have a roadmap to how we're doing that, we're not going to get to where we want to go, right? So that's what our intervention model is about. You can see that it encompasses permanency, preparedness, and community. I'm going to focus on the permanency piece of that graphic today because, as you can see, the blue part of permanency encircles community and preparedness as well. The center point of our intervention with our youth are helping them, again, to either go home, get back home quickly and safely, or find where home will be. And within that, developing family and parenting relationships as well as a safe, stable living environment, either with family or in the community with ongoing family relationships. So that's just the intervention model in a nutshell. If you want to go to the next slide, and here we see the best definition of permanency. So James talked about that a little bit before, but we are not okay with just looking for a mentor or a lifelong connection or an important adult in a youth's life. We want to develop that relationship and have them leave here or at least advance progress to this while they are here to an enduring family relationship that's safe and lifelong. It offers some legal rights and social status of full family membership whenever possible, but absolutely provides for all aspects of their well-being and at the same time assures lifelong connections to those people who have always been important to them. So I'm actually going to queue up a video here. It is youth-guided, family-driven teaming for Carlos. And just a little bit of intro before we play that. It's a 6-minute video. So you will see all of the elements of our intervention at play within this brief video of Carlos. It features his birth mom, as well as a foster mom, Terry, and how we blend the voice of all three of those together in advancing permanency progress for Carlos. So after the video, then I will talk about the 3 core components that we use to help Carlos reach permanency.
For Carlos, high school football has been an outlet, a way to tackle life's challenges. Carlos's mom was just 14 when she gave birth, and in the 18 years that followed, Carlos would end up in more foster homes than he can count.
I went through GCF. I went in when I was like 1 year old, and I've been moving homes and stuff, but I did find some nice people along the way.
Despite always remaining positive, Carlos longed for family. Fortunately, at age 15, he landed in a boys' group home, part of Plummer Youth Promise, a nonprofit child welfare organization. Plummer's mission is to find family for every child. Family in the form of an adult who will be there for the child forever, no matter what.
Talking to the youth and asking them who is important in your life, or who do you think you would like to reconnect with. And it doesn't always go as smoothly, me getting 10 different names. Sometimes I have no one in my life. There's no one. I'm fine. I can do this on my own. And I always respond, actually, everyone has somebody, so we're gonna help you find that person.
Plummer Youth Promise believes permanency is crucial for success for these kids. Some 23,000 youth in the U.S. end up leaving foster homes after the age of 18 with no permanent family, no one to count on. Research shows these youth are at higher risk of dropping out of school, being unemployed, committing crimes, and ending up homeless.
Family means a lot to me, honestly, and it's like, it doesn't have to be people that are like bloodly related to you. Like just anyone that just shows that they want to be there for you, really.
While in the group home, Carlos scoured social media for a sign of his birth mother, Jackie. When he found her, he told his social worker, Karen, who made the arrangements for the two of them to call her.
I've always been looking for him and his sister on Facebook, but I never find them. But I guess he found me first, and I was so happy. He made me cry when he called me.
Their relationship grew stronger, but when it came time for Carlos to move out of the group home, living with Jackie, who as a young teen mom had decided Carlos would benefit from being adopted, was not yet an option. As part of Plummer's youth-guided process, social workers asked Carlos what he'd like to do. Carlos recalled a foster mother he had met at a recent meeting, Terry, and again, Plummer made arrangements.
I always had a house full of boys, so he fit right in. I think it's really important to include the family because we're a unit, and I think the goal is for the kid to feel comfortable and safe. That's the most important thing. But knowing that I can talk to birth mom and birth mom can call me and complain is something that is only going to make him better.
It was beneficial for him to be at Terry's. Just structure and opportunity that existed there. I think Carlos really knew that he was in a good place if he could stay there, but he knew that he needed his mom and needed to still be able to see her. So Carlos was able to say, this is who I need on my team, and those team members were able to put their own stuff aside and prioritize his emotional needs just to be at the table for him.
Also at the table, an entire new foster family. He's particularly close with foster brother Mitchell, with whom he shares many things in common.
Same sports, TV shows, video games, everything. I think we definitely established a connection that'll always be there, like, for life.
And Jackie and Terry's connection is there too. Carlos is now living with his birth mom, but Jackie knows she can reach out to Terry anytime.
If I have something that I really want her to help me with Carlos, she will. She's always there. And I'm happy because I see my son happy.
In just a few months, Carlos will graduate from high school. He wants to play college football. The kid who once longed for family now has a full roster, and he describes himself as happy.
Yeah, I feel like I have a lot of people at my table that will go for bat for me, and also people that can steer me in the right direction even if I need help with anything that has to do with any life problems or just anything really. If I don't know how to do bills or stuff like that, I have people I can ask. A lot of people that I know care about me, and I know that I'll be there.
Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about how we embedded youth-guided family-driven teaming and family search and engagement and permanency readiness for youth parent and family in the work with Carlos. So what does youth-guided family-driven teaming mean? Well, it means that we're prioritizing youth and parent-family voice in this process. And we are blending the planning for safety, permanency, and well-being. We are absolutely driving all the team planning toward a family outcome. We are not talking only about treatment and behavior and what's happening in the moment, but we are looking towards how we build a family outcome. For Carlos, in terms of teaming, you heard him at the end. He hung up his football jersey that said, "Trust the process." This is something we say a lot in our teaming model, that we do not want to put the outcome before the process. Carlos came to us with a goal of adoption at 16, and he had 4 prior adoptive families that were identified for him that did not work out. And prior to that, he, as you heard in the video, his his rights had been terminated when he was a baby. So the process hadn't worked for him for 16 years in terms of permanency, and we need to figure out what would work. So he came with an adoption goal. During that time, after 16, he was given a goal of APLA, another planned permanent living arrangement, which of course, again, wasn't driving him towards a family outcome. So we really needed to work that and figure out how he was going to either get back home or find home. The other thing about Carlos in the teaming process is in the midst of many of his rages on the floor here, and he was a kid who was punching walls and kicking holes in things, and he taught us a lot here about what those rages were about, and in many of them he said, if you guys can't figure this out, I don't know what you want from me. And he was talking about his family situation. He was desperate to figure out what was going to be happening for him. So family search and engagement, that was the other core best practice element that we're working with here. We're starting to engage. Who's important to the youth? Who do they miss in their life? Who are they disconnected from? Who's out there that potentially could be part of the permanency solution for them? And we're not only talking about placement in the beginning, but we're talking about who can be part of decreasing their loneliness, helping them restore some of their emotional cutoffs in their life. And he named a number of relatives at first. We actually located several relatives, and they were an important part of his life, but they couldn't step up to parent him. And in the process of continuing those conversations with Carlos, he finally said, so what about my mom? And we kind of looked at him and we said, I don't know, what about your mom? But let's figure that out and let's try to find her. And like he told you in the video, he found her first on Facebook, and we started the process of figuring out what kind of role she could play, first of all, in his team and his life. We were not thinking placement and reunification at that point. Neither was DCF, neither was Carlos. No one was really thinking that in the very beginning. The other important thing about identifying people is when you heard in the video, at one point he was ready to step down from the group home. You know, he wasn't thriving here. He was actually had one foot in the Department of Youth Services. He had JJ, juvenile justice charges. He was really getting caught up in a lot of stuff here at the group home that wasn't necessarily beneficial for him, and he needed to step down, but it wasn't at a point where he could actually go back home to his mom. And again, we wanted to listen to his voice, and he said, you know, hey, what about that foster mom that I met when I was presenting on a panel a while back? And we reached out to her. So again, we didn't necessarily go the traditional route and look for any old foster family that we might step him down to, but we really needed to figure out that child-specific piece of it. And then readiness. When it did come time for us to be considering his birth mom even more than just how she was involved in his life, but what would it take for him to move back with her, there was a lot of readiness pieces to look at. Of course, it was kind of a heavy lift in the decision. DCF had to get on board. Her parental rights had previously been terminated. She lived in poverty, and there were a lot of really concrete services that we needed to help her with, including finding a new apartment that had a bedroom for Carlos. We also needed to do a lot of readiness around their relationship, that he'd not lived with her his entire life, right? And so we needed to very purposefully focus on increasing their time together, their communication, opportunities for them to spend more time together, for her to practice parenting, for he and her together to figure out how to be a family again. And in all of that, we quickly learned, again, on the floor here at the group home, that during some of his biggest rages, the most regulating intervention for him was for someone to hand him a cell phone where his mom was on the other end of that phone. His mom could always help him to talk him down and help him to regulate. Pretty much blew our mind, right? Because he had never really even lived with her. But he had a connection to her, and it was that relationship that he was able to regulate for when he wasn't able to regulate himself in a lot of other ways. Those are all the signs that were pointing to the fact that we needed to move this along for him to go back home, and as you heard in the video, that's exactly what happened. But it was an innovative and not traditional way of approaching this by blending these three best practice models. So those are the core components of our best practice. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the final two slides in our Plummer transformation, but one with staff development, right? So you might assume that we needed to do a fair amount of training, coaching, consultation, both intensively up front in the beginning as well as in an ongoing way to help staff think about their roles differently. So not only the clinical roles, but also the milieu and floor staff roles were different in this kind of model if we were going to advance permanency outcomes. So that's exactly what we did. We continued ongoing monthly permanency consults here, regular training in permanency, as well as a lot of continued coaching, and we both do peer coaching at this point since we're 5 or 6 years into this, as well as coaching from external consultants as well, but really continuing to keep that happening so we are at the top of our game in terms of innovative permanency practice. Also, we now offer opportunities for our staff to participate in the permanency practice leadership projects, events, site engagement to continue to help them develop in this. And the last slide in Plummer transformation was data, right? So we talked about the permanency goals. The state, as Derek mentioned earlier, always has a permanency goal for each youth that comes here. And in addition to that, we want to make sure there's plan A, B, and C, right? Because we have to work concurrently. So sometimes, actually, the goal that youth come here with, if it's APLA, another planned permanent living arrangement, doesn't mean they're necessarily going to get a parent out of that. The goal would be for a place to live. So we want to make sure there's a concurrent goal for them to have an emotionally secure and, if possible, legal parenting relationship. We want to make sure that our permanency goals we're working towards identify a person, not just a placement, and that we truly are advancing either going home or finding home. So to do that, we've been gathering and analyzing data differently than we did before, right? So our last two slides here are just a little sample of the data that we're gathering. So here in this slide, it's the matrix that we use called the permanency rating scale. And when youth come here, we rate them where they are, 1, 2, 3, or 4, in the 3 categories on the left. The first is family and parenting. So where are they now in terms of having a lifelong nurturing parent and family relationship? And safe and stable living, where are they on the scale in terms of getting back to living safely with family? Or the left side of the bottom one on the left column, where are they, if they can't live with family, towards safe and stable living in a community, in addition to having a strong, emotionally supportive family and parenting relationship. So we're often, rating kids when they come in, and then we rate them every 4 to 6 weeks after that, and then rate them again at discharge, and our goal is for them to move along that rating scale while they're here. So the last slide in our last minute here will show you where we are on that. Let's just say outcomes are showing promise, right? So in FY16, we had the average length stay here for youth in the group home was 7.3 months. In FY17, it's 5.2 months, went down a bit. The number of youth served was 38 and then 46. The youth discharged was 24 and 22. And here's the more significant ones. The percent that increased in their family and parenting relationships in FY16 was 68%, and in FY17 was 50%, partly due to the shorter periods of stay that they've had here, so we had shorter time to work on those relationships, but significant increases in them moving along towards having emotionally secure, stable parenting and family relationships. And the bottom line is that 66% of those youth in FY16 and 55% in FY17 did advance on that rating scale and were discharged with a safe, emotionally secure parenting relationship. So we're excited about that. I'm going to just turn it back over to James to just say thank you and wrap us up.
Thanks, Lauren. A couple resources here if you want to learn more. But thank you for the opportunity to kind of share our transformation. It's been great. It's been really positive. It continues to still be a work in progress. And thank you, Derek and DCF, for joining us on this call, and BVI for the opportunity.
And thank you too. Appreciate hearing the leadership vantage point and strategies from James and the partnership with DCF through Derek, and more specific strategies through Lauren, and certainly always appreciate hearing the voice of young people through the video of Carlos and talking about his team and who is on his team. So here's some contact information. As I mentioned earlier, you can download the PDF on the bottom left-hand side. We're going to open up the lines for questions and comments and answers, and we have the folks from Plummer and Derek online here. And before we do that, I want to introduce Lily Wynn, who's the Director of Policy, Systems Coordination, and Programming at the Texas Health and Human Services Commission. And while you're thinking of your questions, to either type into the chat box or to say orally on the phone, I know that Lily had wanted to mention an announcement.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Sherry mentioned, I work at the Texas Health and Human Services Commission, and I am very pleased about the partnership that we have been having with the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services to bring you this webinar. I also would like to invite everyone and encourage everyone to attend the Texas BBI training event that will be held on May 23rd and 24th in Houston, Texas at DePel Children's Center. During that event on May 23rd, Sherry Hammock with the National Building Bridges Initiative will be providing training on BBI, and our featured presenter from our BBI expert RTC will be Dr. Jeremy Cahombine, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Children's Village in New York City. And he has a great deal of experience serving children involved with the child welfare system, and will be able to provide a great deal of wisdom to our Texas RTCs who work closely with the child welfare system and also serve children, especially in the Houston area, who are from urban neighborhoods. And then on the second day of the training, on May 24th, the Department of Family and Protective Services leaders from that agency, as well as leaders from the Texas Health and Human Services Commission and the Texas System of Care, will be working closely with those RTCs who are participating to provide some guided strategic planning and technical assistance to help all of our participating RTCs to develop their next steps for building bridges initiative implementation at their facilities. And then we will continue providing that technical assistance through the rest of 2018. So I highly encourage you to attend this event to be able to receive this personalized technical assistance from both DFPS and also the National Building Bridges Initiative. So this is a very good opportunity. Now I will turn it back over to Sherry for our Q&A.
Okay, so we're going to open up the chat box and the phone lines for any questions about the information that you've heard. Here's a question from Amanda Martin, and she asked, can you give an example of a common time frame and services you provide for youth to transition to their identified home? And that would be to the folks at Plummer, I think. So Lauren or James, can you respond to that?
So just to understand the question, you want to know an example of a common time frame for kids to transition home. Is that the question?
Yes, an example of like a common time frame and services that you provide for youth to transition to an identified home.
And so do you mean from the time that we identify they're going to be transitioning to, or from the time that they enter into the Plummer group home?
Well, I'm looking in the chat box to see if there's additional clarification.
I'll talk about both of those until we hear. But so with the average length of stay being once it's identified,
Yep.
okay. So yeah, once it's identified, again, that's that question is very individualized and customized, right? So we're not looking at a specific time frame. We're looking at not delaying permanency. On the other hand, we're not looking at making it happen quickly if there needs to be some pacing around that. So it's more about what that youth-guided, family-driven team is saying. That is a group of people that have come together around this youth to figure out what role they can play in the permanency solution. And so let's just give the example of Carlos. So his team was meeting the whole time that he was with us, and Jackie, his birth mom, joined that team. Terry, his foster mom, also joined that team. Some of the relatives that we had located early on joined that team. There were some professionals on that team. But they were all the ones making the decision about what the permanency outcome was going to be together with DCF and Plummer, and what the timing of that should be, right? So we wanted to make sure that his relationship with his mom was strong enough and that they'd had enough opportunity to practice and visit together and learn to be a family again before they were living together. We also wanted to make sure that all the concrete supports were in place. So in that situation, it was, you know, several months until he actually moved in there. We've had some kids that have been shorter than that, some kids that have been longer and might have been, you know, much more than 2 or 3 months. So it really is very customized, and we really are listening to youth and family voices on the team about that, and professionals working collaboratively with them. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, and just to comment, it's important to recognize sometimes the geographical barriers when we find family that, you know, affect the timeline from a real practical standpoint. So we found families in other states, and of course we need to go meet the family and assess safety and risk and begin to develop a relationship. And it's not, if someone's local, you can arrange once a week meetings. And when they're states away, you can't arrange once a week flights. You can Skype and be creative with technology, but, and I'd imagine, you know, it's different in every state depending on how large the state is and the geographic area, but that certainly has an impact on the timeline. That's a real part of the equation.
I think Derek's going to add.
I would just say from the state agency perspective, with regard to our pilot work, is these are typically youth that we had already identified were lingering in care for unnecessary periods of time, or were really at high risk of continuing in care without in IPS intervention. So I think, you know, it's a really great question in the sense of, you know, how do we look at it with regard to time frames and outcomes, and then kind of compare that with traditional lengths of stay, and then how we ensure that, you know, transitions to family are successful. I think as opposed to some of our much clearer, shorter term placement kind of interventions, I think we had identified specific youth that, for a number of different reasons, did not specifically have some sort of transition plan in place.
Thank you for that response, and I see another question that is coming through. I just wanted to add, you know, generally speaking, we always talk about transition planning beginning upon admission as well, but I know in Texas, the when you hear Lauren and others talk about the youth-guided or youth-driven team, then I think about the wraparound, the child and family wraparound team, and also the other forum, which is not as customized perhaps to an individual, individual youth, but the community resource coordination groups in Texas that, you know, that could lend that team process to help garner those services and supports in the community when you're looking at discharge. So here's another question that says, speaking of timelines, can you describe what happens when the child's behavioral symptoms interfere with their permanency planning? And again, I'll ask Plummer to, folks from Plummer Youth Promise to respond to that.
Okay, I'll start with this, and then James and Derek, feel free to add. But yes, it's a great question, a common situation, right? At some point along the way, we're going to figure out that kids' behavior is, we need to really plan around that, right? So for far too long, we've heard that, you know, oh, this youth isn't ready for family. And what we're about in our permanency readiness component of the practice is figuring out what will it take to get the youth ready. So what will it take to get this youth ready to be with family, and what will it take to get the family ready to parent this youth and sustain a lifelong commitment to them? So we really have to look very closely at what the behavior is and where it's coming from, right? So what's behind that? Ambivalence is a really prevalent thing. So youth who have been separated from family for very long get very fearful that it's not going to be any different than when they go back. Or kids who are not going back to family but moving on to another family sometimes don't believe that it's ever going to happen. And so that behavior can be destabilizing. Again, the ambivalence can be on a family member, a parent or family member's side, and we have to figure out what's behind, again, that ambivalence. Remember, for Carlos, what was behind a lot of those rages is he really didn't believe that we were going to help him solve the fact that he'd grown up in care for 16 years and that he'd ever get back to family. Also, sometimes, as you heard for Carlos, it wasn't really a fancy clinical strategy that helped him self best. It was, in fact, a relationship with his mom. And so we do need to figure out for kids what's going to help them regulate, and the fact that we're moving permanency work forward already is regulating for kids. As Derek said earlier, it increases kids' sense of hopefulness about the situation, and we often see very strong behavioral gains consistently through the process because kids once for a long time are now more hopeful about the fact that they can be in touch with family, that they're going to go back to family, or that there will be a family they can grow up with outside of care. Anything you'd want to add to that, James or Derek?
I mean, I just think it's really important to be prepared and understand that this work can be really difficult for the kids and families that we work with, and have a plan around that, and not let the behavioral challenges get in the way of working with and towards family. And we see that a lot when we work with other programs through our unbundled permanency work, where someone has a 2-hour visit at the program with a family member they haven't seen and have really mixed feelings about that for years. And then that family leaves and the young person is dysregulated and leads to a behavioral episode, and then the staff get really worried and concerned and suggest we got to hold off on these visits. And we got to recognize that's part of the healing process and shouldn't be a barrier towards working towards family. But I think it's very natural for residential providers to really be in protection mode and safety mode around some of those. So I think really identifying those things ahead of time, that really it would almost be odd if those kind of meetings did not trigger real strong emotional reactions and dysregulation.
I would just echo that as well. From a protective agency standpoint, we kind of share in that same view. I think James identifying that it really needs to be discussed and planned for does as well with the state agencies, because I think at any given opportunity, either workers themselves, frontline workers, supervisors, or managers could also get caught up in that, protection component of it. Like when there's a presentation that's seen as a behavioral episode, how do we respond to that? It must be a negative situation rather than a natural part of the process. I would say through our IPS model, the IPS pilot project, it's a little bit of a different perspective, although we're certainly excited and encouraged by plumbers involving that work in all of their congregate care services. When it comes time to our pilot project, we really are speaking specifically about youth who have lingered in care for extended periods of time. So again, you know, there's this notion that we're really ready to let the service loose and try to come up with some way to establish permanent connections. So we have a little bit more freedom than, say, you know, a typical referral goal and expectation from a congregate care placement.
Thank you so much. And a similar question was posed, and I don't know if you had anything additional to add to that says, what are your thoughts when a child is adopted or fostered at a toddler age and then given up to the system once they're in their teens and start acting up? And I think you spoke to that, but if there was anything you wanted to add, there's another question about outcomes after that. But is there anything you would like to add to the comment around behavioral health challenges with, you know, in the reference or in the context of permanency planning?
So this is Derek again from DCF. I would just say, just from our perspective, I mean, that certainly is an ever-increasing pool of clients that we're engaging with. In addition to older adolescents who have never been in substitute care, populations of adopted youth are a growing population here. And I think as an organization, I mean, we've become very clear about how we're looking at that, and that the sense of having open adoption situations kind of from the start is really one of our driving practices. Obviously, that alone doesn't take the place of immediate permanency, which is what folks try to establish through adoption, but it certainly is something that we try to do in every possible scenario.
Yeah, I would say we have had many kids at Plummer Youth Promise here who came having been adopted early on in life. And in fact, I was just coming from a consult with two of our staff today, and we talked about two different youth, and both of them had been adopted early in life. And what we see primarily is related to the solutions for them moving on in terms of permanency is some blend of reconnection with adoptive family as well as reintroduction of birth family. So that's been missing from our adoption practice for a very, very long time, that we have really not very often successfully blended together kids' first family with their adoptive family. And where that leaves kids is in a very ambivalent situation where they're shouldering a lot of family loyalty pieces. And so pretty much every adopted youth that I can remember in the last several years that's been at Plummer, a big piece of the solution for them is figuring out how to integrate adoptive family and birth family relationships for them. And for some kids, they've returned to adoptive families that they had been disrupted from. For others, have not returned to live there, but have figured out some level of relationship and connection with those families while blending their relationships with birth families. So that is it's absolutely central piece of the clinical work with them.
Thank you for that. And I would just add, too, I think as we talk about permanency and adoption and foster and behavioral health, is really looking at the different systems to see if there are tools and services that can be offered, and thus the need for those partnerships and collaborations with child welfare and behavioral health across the board. I mean, certainly into education and juvenile justice as well. So one of the next question is, are you all using any evidence-based tools to measure outcomes for readiness as it relates to permanency? Great question. Do you have a response
Sure.
there?
This is James. In terms of evidence-based tools, we have committed as an organization to collaborative problem solving. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, but it's an evidence-based practice, and the idea behind it is that kids can do well if they can, and if they can't, something's in the way. And it's a very different way at looking at challenging and disruptive behaviors, but it's a very kind of comprehensive training system to have our staff up to date on that, and we've committed to that very seriously. But what we like about CPS is it can be a big part of the readiness work because we can train families on the same approaches that our staff use to manage difficult behaviors. So the same techniques we use in the milieu could be applied in all different settings, particularly in a family setting. And it was really important for us to have kind of a behavioral support system that could be transferred to family for all of our kids. And that's what that's what CPS brings to us. And it ties into readiness. You know, it challenges the use of traditional token and point and level systems, which are not transferable home. So, you know, if we were to be practicing in that way, it would challenge some of the readiness work that we're really doing and preparing families to manage their behaviors. So it's been a very effective tool and part of our practice in general, but it's very much in support of our permanency work.
And so collaborative problem solving, that is evidence-based, and then the other readiness pieces that are not evidence-based but certainly informed on the best and promising practices out there are that it's readiness for the youth, meaning how have we helped them to clarify past, where they've been, what's happened to them, but how have we helped them to integrate their family relationships. Again, kids in child welfare have been members of multiple families over time, and we need to figure out how to integrate the ones that they need ongoing relationships with over time. And then the third piece is how are they going to get to belonging and claiming within a family now. And for parent and family readiness, it's about have we provided full disclosure and plenty of opportunities for this parent and family to understand the full range of this youth's needs and how they might be able to meet those needs. Have we also provided a process for them that's a mutual exploration of how they will maintain an unconditional, legal, and lifelong commitment to this young person over time? And again, then what supports, resources, both informal and formal, they might need to continue to sustain permanently over time.
Thank you so much to the both of you for that. Thank you for the question, too. These are all great questions. So we've got 5 more minutes and certainly open to take additional questions, and the phone lines are open as well as the chat box on the online. So feel free to add to that. I know the additional thing I would say as far as in measuring outcomes is to really, as I said in the beginning, is to look for those post-discharge outcomes and as they relate to permanency and all, and to include those and for the outcomes to help inform the work so that frontline staff are aware of some outcome measures that they need to be tracking to be aware of practice, as well as policymakers and funders. All up and down, those measures are important. So there's a question from Shannon. Did judges have to get educated on the BBI principles, and have they been open to creative permanency solutions for youth? And so I'll ask that of the Plummer team there.
Sure, I'll start, and then Derek and Lauren can add if they'd like. I think that the judges' understanding and support of permanency, at least in the context that we've described it in this webinar, is inconsistent across the state. I think some judges are really eager to learn more about it, and I understand that there's an ongoing dialogue at the judiciary level as well as across the state around Health and Human Services around increased awareness and improving permanency outcomes. And I know that the judiciary is at the table. I can say for sure our Chief Justice of the juvenile juvenile court system here in Massachusetts is very much in support of improving permanency outcomes, doing things like creating a judge's desk guide around ways to help facilitate permanency, thinking creatively about being really proactive to avoid placement. So the dialogue is happening. I think there's oftentimes a disconnect between, the real senior judges and the day-to-day judges practicing in the courtrooms. But there's no question there's a live dialogue, in my opinion, about the court's role in this. And to be honest, you can't really achieve full system-wide transformation unless they're at the table with us, part of those discussions, and they at least are on a senior level.
Yeah, I would echo James's comments and just say that there definitely is an array of response across the state. As it pertains to the pilot project being done in our office locally, the youth who have been identified for that pilot project have typically been involved in various legal situations in the court, both care and protection type custody cases and CRA, which are child requiring assistance cases here, on a number of different occasions. So the judges overseeing those cases involving those youth have an extensive knowledge of their trajectory, both with protective services and within the legal system. So I can say for those youth identified in our process, in our pilot project, they have clearly been in support, just knowing that they've been lingering in care unnecessarily. As that pertains to advancing our pilot project beyond the certain number of youth identified by the office to younger adolescents lingering in care, that would be obviously more a work in progress.
Thank you for that. This is Sherry. I just wanted to add to that we know that we'll get better outcomes, right, from better positive outcomes for young people and families when we're collaborating among those systems. So you know, we heard with Carlos that there was some JJ contact, juvenile justice contact, but certainly when we cross systems, because youth and family have, hopefully we can work towards one plan of care as opposed to different multiple ones. So having the behavioral health or mental health side working with child welfare and working with juvenile justice and even education. I wanted to point to a resource on the BBI, the Building Bridges Initiative website under products and tools. We've turned out a best practices for residential interventions for youth and families, a resource guide for judges and legal partners. There's an executive summary and then a fuller blown, more expanded version of the guide, so I would point you to that. I think when we do have successes within a state or with, you know, in working with juvenile justice, if there's any opportunities with meetings with legal partners or if there's any forums with family court judges or where we can bring the judges that we've worked with successfully into those forums to talk about that, then that's a win, I think, for systems and certainly for youth and families as well. So thank you for that question. And Lauren, if you had anything to add, I didn't want to skip over you, but I wanted to interject those resources and thoughts.
No, I don't have anything to add right now. Thanks.
Okay, here's another question, and I'm going to mention to those that there, and additionally, besides the handout under the file share on the lower left-hand side, there'll be a few evaluation or survey questions to give us feedback so we can figure out how to improve webinars as well. So I'll point you to that as we are still addressing questions. Here's another question from Settlement Home. I'm curious about if there's any follow-up with the youth who move in with their families. If there is follow-up, how long after does this follow-up occur? That's a great question. And I'll point to Plummer, to James, Lauren, or Derek for you to respond.
Sure, it is a great question. Our residential contracts here in Massachusetts have a follow-along service attached to it. And there are different terms for it, but it's essentially attached to your group home contract. They authorize at least upon discharge 3 months of aftercare. And I think it's roughly around 1 to 2 times a week check-in, some ongoing case management and transition services. so on and so forth. And that applies when kids return home, and it also applies when kids might return to their own apartment. Now, keep in mind, we oftentimes see older youth in the foster care system transition from one of our residential programs to an apartment, but with family they didn't have before they came to us. So we can still continue to do the family work for them. From a Plumber Home perspective, we are at the very beginning stages of tracking longitudinal data over time and building that system, and that's not entirely built yet, and we're not in a position to report out on that. But I think more importantly, although we have this once-a-week follow-along service for kids that transition from a group home to home or to family, I think it needs to be more intense. You know, I see kids leaving a residential program with 24-hour support, skilled staff to respond to different kind of behavioral concerns in episodes, a team of professionals constantly paying attention and looking and helping, and then we transition them home, knowing that there will be some bumps in that transition, and really scale back the support and services. So I think, and this is an internal conversation we're having here, how can we better support kids home? Can we have respite available if they need it right away? Can we have direct care staff available to go home and support parents and families when they run into kind of challenging situations? So we've done, I think, a really good job of finding family, supporting family, and preparing kids to return back to family. And I think we need to be better at ensuring that transition is successful and that we can intensify the services as necessary over time to support that reunification successfully. Sometimes it might be a once-a-week check-in, and sometimes it might be really intense day-to-day check-in or all-day support. But I think that's the dialogue we're starting to begin to have here. And I think that's really important as any provider or state system thinks about effective permanency practices, to build that really appropriate and intense, to the degree it's required, transitional services and support at home.
So I would just add to that and indicate, along with James, that in any scenario where a returning to parents or transitioning to family is in place, depending on the legal variables with regard to what type of custody it is, there are some pretty concrete expectations regarding the length of time that we would continue to be involved with them, and by virtue of that, the length of time that we would expect our providers to continue to be involved with families where that type of transition occurs, just in order to ensure that it's potentially as successful as it can be. I think here in Massachusetts, we're lucky in that we have, at any given point, we have at least a half dozen different pilot projects that are really around transitioning congregate care spending towards community support type services. So I would say locally our office benefits from our close relationship with Plumber Home in that we really can create some uniqueness and unbundling of how we secure services or expect families to be supportive. So we oftentimes take what we might learn in another area with another provider and reach directly out to Plumber and ask about intensifying a level of support that they're providing to a family, and really we work out the administrative part beyond that.
And I would add just one more comment from a kind of different angle on that question, is related to Carlos's story and what he and his family needed for support. There's technically some policy barriers in Massachusetts related to reunifying with a birth parent that had been previously. Her rights had been terminated, and normally Carlos wouldn't have been able to go home with ongoing financial support by going back to live with his mom in this situation. And so it really took a lot of advocacy and partnership together with our DCF partners to be able to make that happen for Carlos. And in situations where poverty is an issue, that would have stood in the way of permanency for Carlos, that real financial need, if it had not been resolved. So just encouraging other states out there to, when it will enable kids to have permanency, to be able to advocate for that and work together with your state partners for the best resolution.
And one quick follow-up point. I had talked about, transitional services largely being professional supportive services. A big part of the permanency work that we do is about building a team of natural community and family supports that can kind of step in and help with that transition. So it might be a neighbor that can take Johnny overnight on a weekend where he's struggling, or an aunt or uncle that can step in and help or do certain things. So a big part of the teaming work is about developing a natural support system so that you don't have to rely on a professional community for a successful permanency, transition and outcomes.
Thank you for that, and thank you for those great responses and the good question too. I'd said on the front end that when we look at programs and interventions that for residential interventions, that we really do want to pay attention to the success, or the bottom line being how that young person is doing in their home and in their community. So that's a great question, and able to get data on that as far as how far out. I'll point to another program that has had a lot of success with their transformation journey, and they've gone as far as 3 years post-discharge from a young person is that they'll guarantee their results and then have them come, if they have to be rehospitalized or something, that they'll cover the charges for that. So that's a very, very much a commitment to this. We're shooting for this being your last placement, in that work towards young people and working with their families. So any other questions? And then here's a question that says, what has Plummer done to try to ensure cultural and linguistic competence?
I think we try to hire a diverse staff that represents the kids and families that we work with. But I do think that this is an area that we recognize we want to continue to improve. We've been really, really focused on permanency in terms of kind of resources and staff and training. And in recent kind of discussions around just ongoing quality improvement, we recognize that we want to try to improve that. It's a discussion on the board level. It's a discussion when we're actively recruiting new board members, and it's a priority for us to try to have a diverse board that represents the kids and families that we work with. We, when possible, try to have board members with lived experience, and we've been successful with 2 board members that both actually had lived at our group home. And we've hired staff that have, as kind of peer supports and mentors, to be on staff to work with our kids in the milieu. And so we've kind of scratched the surface from different angles. However, I'm not sure we can't stand to improve quite a bit more.
I think from the point of view of the youth experience, what's really, really important, and we've seen over and over again in our model, is the team that we're constructing are constructed of people from the youth family network and community network. So it's a very strong piece in terms of getting them back to family, as they identify it, and back to their communities. So connected, obviously, back with their own culture again. So that's been a really important piece, not rather than only, connecting them to any community. Our efforts are really towards their community.
And thank you for that. Again, I think those are excellent examples, making sure that you hire a diverse staff and then looking at board composition. And I know that that's something that we're cognizant of, when we're communicating the BBI framework and putting on trainings. So that's a great question. I also want to point to, on the BBI website, under products and tools, there's a self-assessment checklist for staff of residential programs that's around promoting cultural diversity and cultural and linguistic competency. So that may be a worthwhile tool for you to look at with an eye of CLC, or Cultural and Linguistic Competency. I think that we're hoping that that component is woven through, you know, everything that we're doing, the way we're doing business across the board, but it's certainly something to be deliberate about and to look through a lens of CLC. So thank you for that. I think those are great examples at Plummer. I want to say thank you very, very much to the folks at Plummer Youth Promise and to Derek from the Child Welfare Agency in Massachusetts. We really appreciate you sharing and taking the time to share your expertise and experiences. And thanks to those of you who have taken the time to look at different strategies and how you can use those within your programs here in Texas. So thank you again, and we hope that you're always looking for ways to improve your practices, and we're here to help support you however we can at BBI. Have a great week.